The laughter from the corner office wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice through the heavy silence of the open floor plan. They had stuck a neon yellow note on the back of his perfectly pressed shirt 5 minutes ago, and the group by the water cooler was just waiting for him to turn around. But the man at the desk didn't move a muscle, his attention entirely consumed by the rhythmic alignment of his pencils, unaware that the storm was gathering directly behind him. Clara watched from 2 desks away, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest, a sensation that had become her constant companion since the divorce finalized. She wanted to stand up and rip the note off his back, but her eyes drifted to the photo of her daughter on her desk, reminding her that she was 1 paycheck away from eviction. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a headache-inducing frequency that seemed to vibrate in sync with her fear, paralyzing her in her chair while her conscience screamed at her to act. Lucas sat with the posture of a statue, his fingers moving with surgical precision as he adjusted the spacing between his stapler and his keyboard. To the others, his need for absolute order was a punchline, a quirk to be mocked during happy hours where he was never invited. They didn't see the brilliance hiding behind his avoidance of eye contact, nor did they understand that the chaos of the office was physically painful to him, like a radio stuck between stations at maximum volume. Mr. Robert, the department head, stood at the center of the giggling group, checking his expensive watch with a look of bored malice. He had been looking for a scapegoat for the quarterly losses, and his gaze kept drifting between the autistic man who wouldn't play office politics and the single mother who couldn't afford to fight back. The cruelty in his smile wasn't accidental. It was the practiced expression of a man who built his career on the broken spirits of those beneath him. The air in the room felt stagnant, recycled too many times, carrying the faint scent of stale coffee and impending doom. Clara typed a sentence she would have to delete later, her hands trembling slightly as she saw Mr. Robert whisper something to his assistant, who immediately began typing on her phone. It felt like watching a trap snap shut in slow motion, the mechanism oiled by years of corporate indifference, and Clara realized with a jolt that the target wasn't just Lucas. Every time Lucas blinked, it was a hard reset, a way to block out the overwhelming sensory input of the buzzing phones and the shifting shadows. He knew they were there, hovering at the edge of his peripheral vision like vultures waiting for a carcass, but he didn't understand why. His world was binary, built on ones and zeros, right and wrong, and he had no algorithm to decode the gray area of unprovoked human cruelty. Clara took a sip of water, but it tasted like metal, the bitter flavor of her own cowardice coating her tongue. She remembered the way Lucas had silently left a granola bar on her desk last week when she had skipped lunch to save money, a gesture of observation that no one else had made. That small act of kindness now weighed on her like a stone, demanding a repayment she wasn't sure she was strong enough to offer. A sudden burst of laughter erupted as someone threw a crumpled ball of paper that landed near Lucas's trash can, missing the rim by an inch. He paused, his hand hovering over the mouse, and for a terrifying second, Clara thought he might scream or break down, giving them exactly what they wanted. Instead, he simply reached down, picked up the paper, and placed it gently in the bin, refusing to acknowledge the taunt, which only seemed to infuriate the audience more. The injustice of it all burned in Clara's throat, a fire fueled by the memory of every time she had been dismissed or talked over in meetings. She saw herself in Lucas, not in his neurodivergence, but in his vulnerability, the shared status of being an outsider in a world designed for the loud and the ruthless. They were 2 broken pieces in a machine that demanded perfection, and the machine was getting ready to discard them both to save itself. Mr. Robert finally stepped away from the group and began walking toward Lucas's desk, his shoes clicking on the linoleum with an authoritative rhythm. He held a file in his hand, a thick folder that looked far too ominous for a Tuesday afternoon, and Clara noticed the red tab sticking out from the side. It was a disciplinary file, the kind that usually preceded a security escort out of the building, and her heart hammered against her ribs. Lucas didn't look up as the shadow of his boss fell over his workspace, darkening the meticulous arrangement of his supplies. He was deep in the code, finding patterns where others saw only noise, his mind a fortress that was about to be besieged. He sensed the intrusion, the disruption of his personal space, and his breathing hitched, a subtle sign of distress that only a mother or a kindred spirit would notice. Clara gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles turning white, a silent prayer forming on her lips that she knew wouldn't be answered. She saw Mr. Robert place the file on the corner of Lucas's desk, deliberately knocking over a cup of pens in the process. The pens scattered across the floor with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room, destroying the order Lucas had spent all morning maintaining. The entire office seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the explosion, waiting for the meltdown that would justify everything they were about to do. But as Lucas stared at the scattered pens, something shifted in his eyes, a glint of something that wasn't fear, but absolute terrifying clarity. He didn't scramble to pick them up. He just slowly turned his chair to face Mr. Robert, his expression unreadable, calm in a way that was far more unsettling than any scream. A heavy silence descended, heavy enough to crush the air out of the room, as the email notification pinged simultaneously on everyone's computer screen. It was a meeting invite labeled Urgent Restructuring, sent by Mr. Robert, scheduled to start in 10 minutes. Clara looked at Lucas, then at the notification, and realized that the ambush was no longer a threat. It was happening right now, and she had to decide if she was going to be a witness or a warrior. Have you ever witnessed an injustice at work that you were too afraid to stop? Or have you been the one who stood up when no one else would? Tell us your story in the comments below. The walk to the conference room felt less like a commute down the hallway and more like a procession toward an execution. Mr. Robert led the pack, his strides wide and confident, flanked by his usual entourage who whispered jokes that sounded like knives scraping against bone. Clara trailed behind, her legs feeling heavy, almost numb, as if her body was physically resisting the destination. Lucas walked alone, several paces behind everyone else, his gaze fixed on the pattern of the carpet tiles, counting the gray squares to calm his racing mind. He didn't carry a notebook or a laptop, his hands empty at his sides, fingers twitching in a rhythmic sequence that matched a melody only he could hear. To the casual observer, he looked defeated, a man walking to his own demise without a fight, but Clara noticed the stiffness in his jaw, a tension that suggested he was holding something back. The conference room was a glass box in the center of the floor, designed for transparency, but used for intimidation. They filed in, the smell of dry erase markers and cheap leather filling the air, a scent that Clara associated with bad news. Mr. Robert took the seat at the head of the table, spreading his arms wide, as if to claim ownership of the very air they breathed, while the others scrambled for the chairs closest to him, desperate to be in his orbit. Clara hesitated at the door, her eyes scanning the room for a safe harbor, but the only empty chair was next to Lucas, at the far end of the table. It was the exile zone, the place where people sat when they knew their time was up, and by sitting there, she was publicly declaring her allegiance. She took a deep breath, ignored the side eyes from the assistant, and sat down, the cold plastic of the armrest biting into her elbow. Mr. Robert didn't waste time with pleasantries. He simply tapped a key on his laptop, and the projector hummed to life, casting a harsh blue light onto the screen. A graph appeared, a jagged red line plunging downward like a scar across the display, representing the department's productivity over the last quarter. He let the image sit there, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. A psychological tactic designed to make everyone feel guilty before he even spoke a word. "We have a leak," Mr. Robert announced, his voice smooth and dangerous. "Not of data, but of competence." He didn't look at the graph. He looked directly at Lucas, his eyes narrowing with predatory focus. The accusation hung in the air, vague enough to be deniable but specific enough to be understood by everyone in the room as a direct attack on the man who couldn't defend himself socially. Lucas didn't react to the statement, his attention seemingly captivated by a smudge on the glass table, which he began to trace with his index finger. The lack of eye contact seemed to embolden Mr. Robert, who took it as submission rather than a different mode of processing. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a series of errors in the code, highlighted in angry yellow errors that were attributed to Lucas's user ID. Clara frowned, squinting at the screen. The errors looked basic, sloppy, completely out of character for someone who obsessively aligned his stapler. She knew Lucas's work. It was elegant, almost poetic in its efficiency, devoid of the chaotic syntax that cluttered the screen before them. A cold realization washed over her. This wasn't just incompetence being exposed. It was a frame-up, executed with a laziness that was almost insulting. "It's tragic, really," Mr. Robert continued, feigning sadness as he paced the room, "when personal struggles begin to impact professional output." He used the word struggles as a euphemism for Lucas's autism, a dog whistle that made the sycophants nod in solemn agreement. The unfairness of it made Clara's blood boil, a heat rising from her stomach to her face, threatening to spill over into words she couldn't afford to say. Then, Mr. Robert turned his gaze to Clara, his smile widening slightly, a shark sensing blood in the water. And of course, oversight is key. When team members cover for each other's deficiencies, the whole ship sinks. The implication was clear. By sitting next to him, by treating him like a human being, she was complicit in his alleged failure. The room felt like it was shrinking, the glass walls closing in to suffocate them, trapping them in this distorted reality where lies were presented as metrics. Clara looked at Lucas, hoping for a sign, a defense, anything, but he just kept tracing the circle on the table, faster and faster now. Was he breaking down? Was the pressure finally cracking the unique architecture of his mind? Mr. Robert leaned over the table, his hands flat on the surface, invading Lucas's personal space once again. "Lucas, do you have anything to say about these figures?" The question was a trap, a rhetorical device meant to highlight his social awkwardness, to make him stutter or freeze in front of the audience. Lucas stopped tracing. His finger froze on the glass. The hum of the projector fan seemed to get louder, filling the sudden void of sound. He slowly lifted his head, and for the first time since the meeting started, he looked directly at the screen, his eyes scanning the code with a speed that was almost inhuman. "That is not my syntax," Lucas said, his voice quiet but steady, cutting through the room with unexpected clarity. He didn't look at Mr. Robert. He looked at the timestamp in the corner of the slide. "And at 2 p.m. on Tuesday, I was in the server room running diagnostics. My terminal was locked." Mr. Robert scoffed, a dismissive sound that was meant to end the discussion, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Logs can be altered, Lucas. We all know you're capable of that." He moved to click to the next slide, eager to bury the objection under more fabricated evidence. But Lucas stood up. It wasn't an aggressive motion, just a simple unfolding of his limbs, but the change in elevation shifted the power dynamic in the room instantly. He turned to Mr. Robert, his face devoid of anger but filled with a terrifyingly objective curiosity. "Why is your password saved in the cache of the file that supposedly originated from my computer?" The question hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot, visible and choking. Mr. Robert blinked, his confident veneer cracking for a fraction of a second, revealing the panic of a man who realized he had underestimated his opponent. "That's absurd," he stammered, his laugh sounding brittle and forced, trying to rally the room back to his side with sheer dismissal. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast in the fertile soil of the silent room. The other employees exchanged nervous glances, their blind loyalty wavering as they processed the technical impossibility Lucas had just pointed out. If Mr. Roberts' credentials were embedded in the file's metadata, it was a fingerprint left at the scene of the crime, a mistake born of arrogance. Clara felt a surge of adrenaline, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she realized Lucas wasn't just defending himself, he was counterattacking. She looked at the screen again, searching for what Lucas saw, but it was just lines of code to her untrained eyes. Yet, she trusted him. She trusted the mind that saw patterns in chaos. The mind that remembered she liked her coffee black without her ever saying it. "Show us," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly, but gaining strength as she spoke. It was the first time she had spoken in a meeting in months, and the sound of her own defiance surprised her. Mr. Robert whipped his head around to glare at her, his eyes promising retribution, but she held his gaze, refusing to shrink back into the shadows. "We don't have time for conspiracy theories," Mr. Robert snapped, reaching for his laptop to close the presentation. "This meeting is about performance, not debugging." He tried to shut the lid, but Lucas reached out, not to stop him physically, but to place a single finger on the table, a gesture that somehow commanded more authority than a shout. "The cache clears every 24 hours, Lucas stated, his voice devoid of emotion, reciting facts like he was reading a weather report. "If I open the file properties now, the user history will show the last modification. If it was me, it will say Lucas Admin. If it was you, it will say Robert Exec." The room went dead silent. It was a simple test, a binary outcome that would reveal the truth instantly. There was nowhere to hide. Mr. Robert's hand hovered over the keyboard, frozen. To refuse would be an admission of guilt. To proceed would be suicide. He was trapped in a logic loop of his own making. "Open it, Robert." A deep voice rumbled from the back of the room. Everyone jumped. In the corner, obscured by the shadows of the dim lighting, sat the CEO, Mr. Henderson. He was a silent figure who rarely attended departmental meetings, and his presence had gone completely unnoticed until now. He leaned forward, the light from the projector catching the silver in his hair. Mr. Robert paled, his skin taking on the waxy sheen of a melting candle. "Sir, this is just a waste of time." Lucas is clearly trying to deflect from his own incompetence. He tried to sound authoritative, but his voice pitched up an octave, betraying his desperation. "If he is lying, it will take 10 seconds to prove it," Mr. Henderson said calmly, crossing his arms. "Open the properties." It wasn't a request, it was a command from the top of the food chain. The silence that followed was excruciating, filled only by the hum of the projector and the ragged breathing of the man at the head of the table. With trembling fingers, Mr. Robert navigated to the file folder. Every click of the mouse sounded like a hammer striking a nail into a coffin. He right-clicked on the file. The menu dropped down. He moved the cursor to Properties. He hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead, visible even in the blue light. Clara watched Lucas. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. He was simply waiting for the data to validate his reality. He was the only person in the room who seemed completely at peace, anchored by the absolute certainty of truth in a room full of lies. Mr. Robert clicked. The Properties window popped up on the giant screen. The text was small, but to everyone in that room, it looked 10 feet tall. Under Last Modified By, the name was clear, undeniable, and damning. It wasn't Lucas. It wasn't even a generic admin account. It read, Robert Exec. A collective gasp swept through the room, sucking the oxygen out of the space. The evidence was right there, glowing in high definition. Mr. Robert stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land, searching for a lie that could cover this. But the digital trail was absolute. I must have reviewed it," Mr. Robert stammered, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an ally but finding only averted gazes. "I opened it to check his work. That's why my name is there." It was a weak defense, a desperate grasp at a straw that was already burning. "Reviewing a file doesn't change the author of the code blocks," Lucas said softly. He walked over to the laptop, moving with a fluid grace that replaced his usual stiffness. He typed a quick command. The screen shifted to the version history. You didn't just review it. You deleted lines 40 through 80 and replaced them with the corrupt syntax at 2:03 p.m. yesterday. The timestamp was there. The user ID was there. The specific action of deletion and replacement was logged in brutal detail. It wasn't an error. It was sabotage. It was a deliberate, malicious act designed to destroy a man's career. Mr. Henderson stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the floor, a harsh sound that made Mr. Robert flinch. The CEO walked toward the front of the room, his eyes locked on his department head. The air in the room grew heavy with the promise of consequences. "You framed him," Mr. Henderson said, his voice low, vibrating with a quiet fury that was far more terrifying than shouting. "You sabotaged your own department's project to frame an employee for your failures." Mr. Robert slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him. He looked small, pathetic, stripped of the power he had wielded like a weapon. He looked at Clara, pleading silently for some kind of mercy, but she just looked back at him with eyes that were dry and cold. She felt no pity, only a fierce, burning pride for the man standing next to her. Lucas didn't look at the defeated man. He looked at Clara. For the first time, he offered her a small, tentative smile, not a social mask, but a genuine expression of relief. He had navigated the chaos. He had solved the puzzle. But as the CEO opened his mouth to deliver the verdict, Lucas's eyes drifted past him to the doorway. His expression shifted from relief to confusion, then to something approaching fear. Someone else was standing there, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. It was the company's legal counsel, holding a different folder. And she wasn't looking at Mr. Robert. She was looking at Clara. The silence in the room shifted, mutating from the triumphant quiet of justice served into something colder and more uncertain. Clara felt the weight of the legal counsel's gaze like a physical touch, a cold hand resting on her shoulder that sent a shiver down her spine. The lawyer, Ms. Vance, didn't step into the room fully. She leaned against the doorframe, her silhouette cutting a sharp figure against the brightly lit hallway behind her. She held a manila folder tight against her chest, her knuckles white, contrasting sharply with her dark suit. It was the kind of folder that contained non-disclosure agreements and termination letters, not promotions or apologies. Mr. Henderson, who had been moments away from firing Mr. Robert, paused mid-breath, his attention drawn by the sudden shift in the room's energy. He looked at Ms. Vance, a frown creasing his forehead, clearly confused by her timing and her focus on the wrong employee. The CEO was a man who understood power dynamics, and he sensed instantly that the narrative he thought he controlled was about to spiral in a new direction. He lowered his hand, which had been pointing accusatorily at Mr. Robert, and turned his body to face the newcomer. Lucas, sensitive to the slightest change in atmospheric pressure, stopped typing on the keyboard and took a half-step back from the table. His eyes darted between Clara and Ms. Vance, processing the visual data, the stiff posture, the lack of a smile, the targeted stare. He didn't understand the social intricacies of corporate legal maneuvering, but he understood threat detection, and his internal alarms were blaring. He instinctively moved closer to Clara, a subtle shift that placed him between her and the door. "Is there a problem, Ms. Vance?" Mr. Henderson asked, his voice regaining its command, but laced with impatience. He wanted this wrapped up. He wanted the cancer cut out of his company so he could go back to his office. He didn't like interruptions, especially not when he was delivering judgment. The air conditioning hummed loudly in the pause, a white noise that seemed to amplify the tension rather than mask it. "We need to discuss the scope of this investigation," Ms. Vance said, her voice smooth and practiced, the voice of someone who delivered bad news for a living. She finally walked into the room, her heels clicking on the floor with a rhythm that felt too slow, too deliberate. She didn't look at the screen showing Mr. Robert's guilt. She placed her folder on the table, right on top of Lucas's clean workspace. "It appears Mr. Robert wasn't working alone in his mismanagement." Mr. Robert, who had been slumping in his chair awaiting his sentence, suddenly perked up. A flicker of hope ignited in his eyes, desperate and ugly. If the blame could be spread, if the water could be muddied, maybe he wouldn't drown alone. He sat up straighter, smoothing his tie, ready to grasp at whatever lifeline the lawyer was inadvertently offering. He looked at Clara with a renewed sneer, his earlier fear mutating back into arrogance. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling but louder than she expected. "Lucas just proved who did it. The logs are right there." She pointed at the screen, desperate to keep the focus on the undeniable truth. But Ms. Vance didn't even glance at the projector. She opened her folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the glass table toward Mr. Henderson. "The logs show Mr. Robert altered the code," Ms. Vance acknowledged without emotion. "But we have flagged communication from Clara's terminal authorizing access to those specific files." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. "An email sent 3 days ago, granting admin privileges to Mr. Robert's account for a peer review." "That's a lie!" Clara stood up, her chair screeching backward. "I never sent that. I don't even have authorization to grant admin privileges." Her mind raced, trying to remember every email, every click, every moment she had left her computer unattended. Panic clawed at her throat. She looked at Lucas, pleading silently for him to find the error in this new accusation, to work his magic again. Lucas frowned, his brow furrowing deeply. He leaned over the table to look at the paper Ms. Vance had presented. It was a printout of an email header. The timestamp was valid. The sender address was Clara's. But something was wrong. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the text, his brain analyzing the syntax of the message itself. It was too formal, too structured. It didn't sound like Clara. "The IP address," Lucas muttered, his voice barely audible. He looked up at Ms. Vance. "Did you check the originating IP address of that email?" The lawyer blinked, surprised by the technical challenge. "It came from her terminal," she replied dismissively. "IT confirmed it." "Remote access," Lucas said, louder this time. "If someone spoofed her terminal or used a remote desktop protocol while she was at lunch." He turned to the laptop again, his fingers flying across the keys. Mr. Robert lunged forward. "That's enough. You're not touching that computer again." He was desperate now, seeing his second chance at survival threatened by the same mind that destroyed his first. "Sit down, Robert," Mr. Henderson barked, his patience evaporating. He looked at Lucas. "Can you prove it came from outside?" The CEO was a pragmatist. He didn't care about narratives. He cared about facts. And right now, the facts were becoming a battlefield. He gestured for Lucas to continue, overruling his own legal counsel. Lucas didn't answer. He just typed. He pulled up the network traffic logs for the day in question. Lines of data cascaded down the screen like a digital waterfall. "Clara goes to lunch at 12:30 every day," Lucas stated, a fact he knew because he tracked the office routine to feel safe. This email was sent at 12:45. "So, maybe she stayed in," Mr. Roberts sneered. "She's always complaining about having no money. Maybe she brought a sandwich." It was a low blow, using her financial struggle as a weapon against her credibility. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from pure, unadulterated rage. "The cafeteria CCTV," Lucas said, not looking up. "It's on the same network subnet. I can ping the archive." He wasn't asking for permission. He was stating a capability. He was going to hack the building's security feed to provide an alibi. It was a violation of protocol, a fireable offense in itself, but nobody stopped him. A grainy video window popped up on the screen. It showed the cafeteria, the timestamp rolled backward, 12:40, 12:42, 12:45, and there she was. Clara, sitting alone at a small table, eating a yogurt, reading a book. Nowhere near her computer, nowhere near the crime scene. The image was undeniable. Clara was physically incapable of sending that email. The room fell silent again, but this time, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of a trap springing shut on the trapper. Ms. Vance looked at the screen, then at her paper, then at Mr. Robert. Her expression hardened. She realized she had been handed forged evidence. "Who accessed her computer remotely?" Mr. Henderson asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He looked at Mr. Robert, who was now sweating profusely, his face pale and clammy. The CEO turned to Lucas. "Trace the connection. Lucas tapped a few more keys. The remote connection was initiated from... He paused, his eyes widening slightly. It wasn't Mr. Roberts' computer. He looked up, confused. It came from an external IP, a coffee shop down the street. A coffee shop? Mr. Robert echoed, genuinely confused. I was here all day. For the first time, his denial sounded real. He looked as baffled as everyone else. The plot had thickened beyond simple office sabotage. Someone else was involved. Someone outside the room. Who else knew about the file? Clara asked, her voice steady now. Who else wanted us gone? She looked around the table at the silent colleagues, the people who had laughed earlier. One of them, the assistant who had been typing on her phone, suddenly looked very interested in her shoes. Lucas followed Clara's gaze. He looked at the assistant. He looked at the phone she was clutching in her hand. The coffee shop has public Wi-Fi, he said slowly. But to connect to our secure intranet from there, you need a VPN key. Only execs and their direct assistants have those keys. All eyes turned to the assistant. She was young, ambitious, and currently looking like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Mr. Robert looked at her, betrayal dawning on his face. Sarah, he whispered. You helped me with the slides. You said you double-checked everything. Sarah stood up, her chair scraping loudly. I was just following orders, she cried out, her voice shrill. He told me to fix the problem. He said Clara and Lucas were dead weight. She pointed a trembling finger at Mr. Robert, throwing him under the bus to save herself. I told you to document their errors, not fabricate them, Mr. Robert shouted back, the veneer of the professional executive completely gone. They were turning on each other, rats on a sinking ship, exposing the rot at the core of the department. Mr. Henderson raised a hand, silencing them both. He looked tired. He looked disgusted. Get out, he said simply. Both of you. Security will escort you. Do not return to your desks. As the disgraced pair was led out by the legal counsel, the room felt instantly lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted. But Clara wasn't looking at the door. She was looking at the screen, where the log of the remote connection was still visible. There was one line of code Lucas hadn't mentioned, a small, seemingly insignificant tag at the end of the session. Lucas, she whispered, pointing at the screen. What does that mean? System override, Auth 7? Lucas looked at where she was pointing. He stiffened. His face went pale. He quickly closed the window, hitting the escape key multiple times. It's nothing, he said, too quickly. Just a system glitch. But he wouldn't meet her eyes. He began to pack up his things, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. I need to go. I need to reset the server. Clara watched him, a cold knot forming in her stomach. He was lying. Lucas, the man who couldn't lie, who lived in a world of absolute truth, had just lied to her. Why? What had he seen in that last line of code that terrified him more than losing his job? The conference room emptied slowly, the air still thick with the residue of the confrontation, but Clara remained seated, her eyes fixed on the blank screen where the code had been just moments ago. She watched Lucas practically run out the door, his bag slung haphazardly over one shoulder, a stark contrast to his usual methodical exit routine. The victory over Mr. Robert and Sarah felt hollow, overshadowed by the sudden, inexplicable shift in Lucas's behavior. Why would he hide something now, after fighting so hard to reveal the truth? She stood up, her legs feeling shaky, and walked back to her desk, the silence of the office pressing in on her from all sides. The other employees were avoiding eye contact, ashamed of their earlier complicity, or perhaps afraid of becoming the next target of a purge. Clara didn't care about them. Her mind was replaying the last few seconds of the meeting, trying to decipher the flash of fear in Lucas's eyes. System override Auth 7. The phrase looped in her head like a broken record, a piece of a puzzle that didn't fit the picture she had been shown. At her desk, she tried to work, but the letters on her screen blurred together, refusing to form coherent sentences.
She glanced at Lucas's empty chair, the perfect alignment of his pencils now disturbed, a visual echo of his disrupted state of mind. He had said he needed to reset the server, but the server room was in the basement, and she had seen him turn left toward the elevators, heading up, not down. He wasn't going to fix a machine. He was going to confront someone, or hide from something. The curiosity gnawed at her, stronger than her fear of losing her job, stronger than her exhaustion.
She stood up again, grabbing her keycard, and walked toward the elevators, her heart pounding a rhythm of rebellion against her better judgment. She pressed the button for the executive floor, the same direction Lucas had gone, a place she had only visited once during her orientation. The elevator ride felt endless, the numbers ticking up slowly, each ding sounding like a warning bell she was choosing to ignore. When the doors opened, the executive floor was quiet, carpeted in plush wool that swallowed the sound of her footsteps. She peeked around the corner and saw him. Lucas was standing outside the CEO's private office, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself in a rapid, agitated stream. He wasn't entering. He was hesitating, his hand hovering over the intercom button, caught in a paralysis of indecision that was painful to watch. Clara moved closer, hiding behind a large, potted plant, straining to hear what he was saying. Logical inconsistency, variable undefined, root access denied. His words were technical, fragments of a debugging process applied to a real-world dilemma. He was trying to solve a human problem with code logic, and it was failing him. Suddenly, the door to the CEO's office opened, and Mr. Henderson stepped out, looking surprised to find Lucas there. "Lucas," he asked, his voice softer than it had been in the meeting. "Did you need something? You did excellent work today." The praise seemed genuine, but Lucas flinched as if he had been struck. "The override code," Lucas blurted out, unable to hold it in any longer. "Auth 7. It's a legacy command." He wasn't making eye contact. He was staring at Mr. Henderson's tie. "It hasn't been used since the system migration 3 years ago. Only one user profile still has that clearance." Mr. Henderson's expression didn't change, but his stillness became absolute, a predator freezing before a strike. "And whose profile is that, Lucas?" he asked quietly. The hallway felt suddenly very cold, the air conditioning vents blasting a chill that went straight to Clara's bones. "Yours," Lucas said. The word was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the executive corridor it sounded like a shout. "Mr. Robert used the VPN, but the override command, that came from your terminal." "Yesterday morning," Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, the sound too loud in the quiet space. Mr. Henderson's eyes snapped to her hiding spot, his gaze sharpening instantly. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like a teacher catching a student cheating. "Come out, Clara," he said, his voice level. She stepped out, trembling, her legs feeling like jelly. She walked to stand beside Lucas, her instinct to protect him overriding her fear of the man who signed her paychecks. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Did you help them frame us?" Mr. Henderson sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire company. "I didn't help them frame you," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "I set up a honeypot. I knew Robert was leaking data to competitors, but I couldn't prove it. I needed him to think he was safe, to think he could get away with anything." "So you let him target us?" Clara asked, incredulous. "You used us as bait?" The betrayal stung worse than Mr. Roberts' cruelty, because it came from the top, from the person who was supposed to be the ultimate arbiter of fairness. "You watched them humiliate Lucas? You watched them threaten my livelihood?" "I knew Lucas would catch the error," Mr. Henderson said, looking at Lucas with a strange kind of respect. "I knew his mind wouldn't let a syntax error pass. I needed him to expose Robert publicly, to destroy his credibility, so the board would let me fire him without a severance package." "You calculated the probability of my distress," Lucas stated, his voice flat. "You introduced a variable of suffering into my routine to achieve a corporate objective." It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. To Lucas, this was worse than malice. It was inefficiency of the soul. It was necessary, Mr. Henderson said, stepping closer. The company was at risk. Robert was selling us out. I had to sacrifice a few pawns to save the king. He used the chess metaphor casually, unaware of how deeply it cut. We are not pawns, Clara said, her anger finally finding its footing. We are people. I have a daughter. Lucas has a life. You played with us. She stepped forward, getting into the CEO's personal space, fueled by a mother's rage. And now you're heroes, Mr. Henderson countered, his voice hard. Robert is gone. You're both safe. You'll get raises, bonuses. Isn't that what you want? He offered money as a salve for dignity, a transaction he clearly thought was fair. Lucas shook his head slowly. The variable remains undefined, he murmured. Trust is broken. System unstable. He turned around and started walking toward the elevator, walking away from the CEO, away from the explanation, away from the money. Where are you going, Lucas? Mr. Henderson called out, a hint of panic in his voice for the first time. You can't just leave. We have work to do. Lucas stopped at the elevator doors and pressed the button. He didn't turn around. I cannot work in a corrupted system, he said. I am initiating a shutdown. Clara looked at Mr. Henderson, then at Lucas. The choice was clear. It wasn't about the job anymore. It was about integrity. She turned her back on the CEO and walked to stand next to Lucas. I'm quitting too, she said. The elevator doors opened. They stepped inside. Mr. Henderson stood alone in the hallway. The king left without his pawns, realizing too late that the game was over. As the doors closed, Clara took Lucas's hand. It was the first time she had touched him. He didn't pull away. The elevator descended in silence. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the conference room. This was a lighter silence, charged with the electric hum of a decision that couldn't be undone. Clara still held Lucas's hand, her thumb brushing gently against his knuckles, grounding him as he stared fixedly at the changing floor numbers. She realized she had just quit her job, her only source of income, with no backup plan, no savings, and a child to feed, yet her chest felt strangely expansive, liberated from a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. You didn't have to do that, Lucas said quietly, his eyes never leaving the digital display. Your economic variables are precarious. The logical choice was to accept the retention bonus. He wasn't judging her. He was simply stating the math of survival, the calculation he assumed everyone else operated by. Some variables aren't logical, Lucas, Clara replied softly, squeezing his hand. Like loyalty or dignity. She looked at his profile, the sharp lines of his face illuminated by the harsh elevator lighting. I couldn't stay there knowing they view us as disposable. I'd rather be broke than be a pawn. The doors chimed and slid open onto the lobby, revealing the bustling world they were rejoining as unemployed citizens. People rushed past with coffees and briefcases, deeply embedded in the corporate machine they had just ejected themselves from. The contrast was jarring. Everyone else was running a race that Clara and Lucas had just decided to stop running. I have savings, Lucas announced abruptly as they stepped onto the marble floor. I do not spend money on social activities or travel. My expenses are minimal. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. I can calculate a loan structure for you. 0% interest. Clara stopped, stunned by the offer. He was offering her a lifeline before she even asked, processing her financial ruin as a bug he needed to fix. Tears pricked her eyes again, but she blinked them back. Lucas, I can't take your money. We'll figure something out. I have skills. You have, well, you're a genius. Genius is a subjective label, he corrected automatically. I have high pattern recognition capabilities. He paused, looking around the lobby, his eyes narrowing as he processed the chaotic environment. But patterns are everywhere, not just in code. What do you mean? Clara asked, sensing a shift in his tone. He was no longer in shutdown mode. His brain was rebooting, latching onto a new problem. Mr. Henderson's system was corrupt, Lucas said, starting to walk towards the exit, his pace quickening. But the data Robert was stealing, the competitors he was selling to, I saw the transfer logs. I memorized the IP addresses. Clara hurried to keep up with him. You know who was buying the stolen data? This was dangerous information. This was the kind of knowledge that got people sued, or worse. Not just who, Lucas said, pushing through the revolving doors into the bright afternoon sunlight. I know what they were buying. It wasn't just client lists. It was the algorithm for the new predictive model. The one Henderson claims is unfinished. They stood on the sidewalk, the city noise washing over them. Why does that matter? Clara asked, shielding her eyes from the sun. Because the model is finished, Lucas said, looking at her with an intensity that stopped her breath. I finished it 3 months ago. Robert hid it to sell it as his own IP to a rival startup. But he didn't have the encryption key. And you do? Clara whispered, realizing the magnitude of what he was saying. He held the keys to a multi-million-dollar piece of software in his head. I am the key, Lucas said simply. The encryption is based on a sequence derived from my own biometric typing rhythm. No one can unlock it but me. So Robert sold them a locked box. Clara started to laugh, a hysterical bubbling sound. He scammed the scammers. Precisely, Lucas nodded, a faint glimmer of amusement in his eyes. But now the buyers will realize they cannot open the package. They will come looking for the source. A black sedan pulled up to the curb slowly, its windows tinted dark. Clara's laughter died in her throat. Her paranoia spiked. Was it them? Already? We need to go, Clara said, grabbing his arm. Not to my place, not to yours. Somewhere public, somewhere loud. The library, Lucas suggested. It is public, but quiet. I need a terminal. I need to send a message. To who? Clara asked as they began to walk briskly down the street, putting distance between themselves and the ominous car. To the buyers, Lucas said. I'm going to give them the key. Clara stopped dead. What? Why? You'd be helping them. No, Lucas said, turning back to her. I will give them a key that unlocks a different program, a virus, one that will trace their entire network and send the evidence to the SEC. Clara stared at him. He wasn't just a victim. He wasn't just a genius. He was a vigilante. He was about to take down not just a corrupt boss, but an entire ecosystem of corporate espionage. You're going to start a war, Clara said, a mix of fear and exhilaration coursing through her. I am correcting the error, Lucas said, and for the first time he smiled, a real dangerous smile. Shall we proceed? The library was a fortress of silence and dust motes dancing in shafts of afternoon light, a sanctuary that felt worlds away from the corporate battlefield they had just fled. Clara kept glancing over her shoulder as they navigated the stacks, her heart still racing from the sight of the black sedan, though she tried to mask her anxiety for Lucas's sake. He moved with purpose toward the back corner, where the public computer terminals sat in a row like obedient soldiers, his focus narrowing to the task at hand. Are you sure about this? Clara whispered as they sat down. The chair squeaked loudly, a sound that made her cringe. If you upload a virus, that's illegal, Lucas. We could go to jail, real jail, not just HR probation. She watched him pull a sanitizing wipe from his pocket and meticulously clean the keyboard and mouse before touching them. It is not a virus in the traditional sense, Lucas explained, his voice low and devoid of fear. It is a beacon. I am essentially sending a digital flare that illuminates their server structure. I am not destroying data. I am making their hidden data visible. He logged on as a guest, his fingers hovering over the keys for a split second before unleashing a torrent of commands. Clara watched the screen, mesmerizing and terrified. To her, it was gibberish, a cascading waterfall of green text on a black background, but to Lucas, it was a conversation. He was speaking to the machine, negotiating with firewalls, bypassing protocols with an elegance that was almost artistic. "They will think it is the decryption key," he murmured. "They are greedy. Greedy systems prioritize acquisition over security." "But won't they trace it back here?" Clara asked, looking up at the security camera in the corner of the ceiling. "We're on public Wi-Fi, but there are cameras." "I am routing the connection through a series of proxy servers in Estonia, Panama, and Singapore," Lucas said without breaking his rhythm. "By the time they trace the signal, it will appear to have originated from inside their own headquarters." A loading bar appeared on the screen. "Uploading packet. 25%. Clara felt a bead of sweat roll down her back. This was it. They were crossing a line from passive victims to active combatants. She looked at Lucas's face, illuminated by the monitor's glow. He looked alive in a way she had never seen before, engaged, powerful, in control. The office had tried to crush him, to force him into a box, but here, in the infinite space of the code, he was a god. "They underestimated you," Clara said softly, a realization dawning on her. "Everyone did. Even me." Lucas paused for a microsecond. "People confuse silence with emptiness," he said. "They assume because I do not speak, I do not process. But I am always recording." Uploading packet, 50%. Suddenly, a phone rang in the quiet library. It was loud, jarring, and it was coming from Clara's purse. She jumped, fumbling to silence it. She looked at the screen. Unknown caller. Her stomach dropped. Only the school and her ex-husband had this number, and neither would call from a blocked ID. "Don't answer it," Lucas warned, his eyes still on the screen. Clara stared at the vibrating phone. "What if it's about my daughter? What if something happened at school?" The mother's instinct overrode the fugitive's logic. She swiped right. "Hello? Ms. Torres." A smooth, synthetic-sounding voice spoke on the other end. It wasn't a robot, but it was someone using a voice modulator. "We know you are with Lucas. We know what he is doing." Clara froze. "Who is this?" "Tell him to stop the upload," the voice continued, calm and terrifyingly polite. "If that packet reaches our servers, we will release the photos." "What photos?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "The photos of you taking cash from the petty cash drawer 3 months ago. The photos that make it look like you were stealing, even though we know you were just making change." Clara gasped. She remembered that day. She had needed change for the vending machine. She had put a $20 bill in and taken 2 tens. It was innocent. But on a grainy security camera, without context, it would look like theft. "You're bluffing," Clara whispered, but her hand gripped the phone so tight her knuckles turned white. "Are we?" the voice purred. "We also have the footage of Lucas hacking the company system today, edited to look like corporate espionage. If that upload finishes, we send everything to the police. You'll both be in handcuffs by dinner." Uploading packet, 75%. "Lucas," Clara said, panic rising in her throat. "Stop. You have to stop." Lucas didn't stop. "They are lying," he said, typing faster. "It is a standard intimidation tactic. The probability of them having incriminating footage of a benign event is low." "They said they have me stealing," Clara hissed. "They said they'll doctor the footage. Lucas, I can't go to jail. I'll lose custody of Mia." Lucas's fingers froze. The mention of her daughter changed the variable. The equation was no longer about justice or code. It was about a child. He looked at Clara, seeing the terror in her eyes, the sheer maternal desperation that outweighed any corporate victory. Uploading packet, 85%. The voice on the phone spoke again. 10 seconds, Miss Torres. Then we press send." "Lucas, please," Clara begged, tears spilling over. "I believe you, but I can't take the risk. Not with her." Lucas looked at the screen. He looked at Clara. He was winning. He was seconds away from destroying the people who hurt them. But to win, He would have to gamble with Clara's life. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, a pained expression crossing his face. Then, with a single sharp keystroke, he hit cancel. The loading bar vanished. The screen went black. "Good choice," the voice on the phone said, and the line went dead. Clara slumped in her chair, sobbing with relief and shame. She had stopped him. She had let the bad guys win. "I'm sorry," she wept. "I'm so sorry, Lucas." Lucas stared at the blank screen. He didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful. "Do not apologize," he said quietly. "You introduced a new constraint. I adjusted the strategy." "Strategy?" Clara wiped her eyes. "We surrendered." "No," Lucas said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small USB drive. "I anticipated interference. I did not upload the beacon to their servers." He plugged the drive into the computer. "I uploaded a mirror of the packet to a dead man's switch," he explained. "If I do not enter a code every 24 hours, it releases automatically. To everyone, the SEC, the FBI, the New York Times." Clara stared at him, her mouth agape. He hadn't surrendered. He had taken hostages. "Now," Lucas said, standing up and adjusting his jacket, "we have leverage. We are going to negotiate." "Negotiate?" Clara asked, weak with emotional whiplash. "With who?" "With Mr. Henderson," Lucas said. "He thinks he sacrificed us. We are going to show him that pawns can promote to queens." The library computer screen flickered as the USB drive engaged, a small red light pulsing on the device like a heartbeat. Clara stared at it, her tears drying on her cheeks as the magnitude of Lucas's countermove sank in. He hadn't just reacted. He had anticipated. He had built a failsafe into his failsafe. The realization that this quiet man who struggled to make eye contact was playing four-dimensional chess while everyone else was playing checkers filled her with a sudden, fierce hope. "A dead man's switch," Clara repeated, testing the weight of the words. "So, if something happens to us, if we get arrested or worse?" "The truth comes out," Lucas finished for her. He pulled the USB drive out and slipped it into his pocket. "It is a standard protocol in high-risk data management. Mutually assured destruction." He stood up, looking small and fragile in his oversized jacket, yet projecting an aura of invincibility. "We need to meet Henderson," Lucas stated, heading for the exit. "Face to face, not in the office, somewhere neutral." "He won't meet with us," Clara argued, grabbing her purse and hurrying after him. "He fired us. He thinks we're gone." "He will meet us," Lucas said, pulling out his phone, an old brick-like model that looked indestructible. "Because I just sent a text to his personal number, the one only his wife and his lawyer have." "How do you have his personal number?" Clara hissed, as they stepped back out onto the busy street. "I repaired his phone once when IT couldn't retrieve his vacation photos," Lucas said matter-of-factly. "I never delete contact data." He held up the phone. "I sent him coordinates and a single file name, Project Oracle Unlocked.exe. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Project Oracle. That sounded massive. That sounded like the kind of secret people killed for. "Where are we meeting him?" "The Botanical Gardens," Lucas said. "Open space, high visibility, low acoustic interference, and—" He paused, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his face. "I like the Ferns. They are orderly." They took a taxi, using the last of Clara's cash. The ride was tense, every red light feeling like a trap. When they arrived, the gardens were lush and green, a stark contrast to the gray corporate world they had left behind. They walked to the central gazebo, surrounded by perfectly manicured hedges. Mr. Henderson was already there. He was sitting on a bench, looking out of place in his expensive suit amidst the blooming hydrangeas. He looked older than he had in the office, the weight of his double dealing pressing down on his shoulders. He didn't have his security detail. He was alone. "You're persistent," Henderson said as they approached, not bothering to stand. "I'll give you that." We are not persistent, Lucas said, stopping 10 feet away. We are efficient. You tried to discard us to cover your tracks. That was an error. I saved the company, Henderson said, his voice weary. Robert was a parasite. I cut him out. You were collateral damage. It happens. We are not numbers on a spreadsheet. Clara stepped forward, her anger flaring again. You threatened me. You had someone call me and threaten my child. Henderson frowned, genuine confusion clouding his face. I didn't call anyone. I don't use threats like that. That's messy. Clara froze. If Henderson didn't make the call, then who did? Who else was watching them? The paranoia returned, sharper than before. It doesn't matter, Lucas interrupted, focused on the objective. We have the encryption key, and we have the evidence of your entrapment scheme. If we do not check in every 24 hours, the world knows everything. Henderson sighed and finally looked at Lucas. What do you want? Money? A recommendation letter? I want my dignity, Lucas said, and I want justice. Define justice, Henderson challenged. Reinstatement, Lucas said. Not as a junior analyst, as chief technology officer. Clara's jaw dropped. Henderson laughed, a short barking sound. You? CTO? You can't even handle a staff meeting without shaking. I can handle the code, Lucas said, stepping closer, his voice gaining strength. I built the system you rely on. I know where every skeleton is buried, and unlike Robert, I do not steal. I optimize. Henderson stopped laughing. He looked at Lucas, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time. He saw the intellect, the terrifying capability, the absolute lack of deceit. And for her, Henderson pointed at Clara. VP of Operations, Lucas said instantly. She manages the human variables I cannot. She is the interface. Henderson rubbed his temples. This is blackmail. This is a negotiation, Lucas corrected. Leverage is a neutral tool. Suddenly, Henderson's phone buzzed. He looked at it, and his face went pale. It's the board, he whispered. They're asking about a security breach. They received an anonymous tip. Lucas checked his watch. I set a preliminary timer. A small sample of data was released to the Internal Audit Committee 30 seconds ago. Just a teaser. You actually did it. Henderson looked at Lucas with fear now. Stop it. Stop the rest. Do we have a deal? Lucas asked, his finger hovering over his phone screen. Henderson looked at his vibrating phone, then at the two people he had underestimated. He realized he was checkmated. He nodded slowly. Deal. CTO and VP. Just stop the leak. Lucas tapped his screen. Timer paused. Clara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for hours. They had won. They had actually won. But as Henderson stood up to shake hands, a gesture Lucas ignored, a noise cut through the tranquil garden air, the sound of sirens, getting louder, coming closer. Henderson looked at the entrance of the garden. I didn't call them, he said, panic rising in his voice. Neither did I, Lucas said. Blue and red lights flashed through the trees. Police cars were pulling up to the curb. Not for Henderson, not for Robert. They were swarming the gazebo. Clara Torres! Lucas Silva! A voice boomed over a loudspeaker. Stay where you are! You are under arrest for corporate espionage and extortion. Clara grabbed Lucas's arm. They set us up, she screamed. The deal was a trap. No, Lucas said, staring at the approaching officers, his mind racing through the variables. Henderson didn't call them. The buyers did. The people who wanted the algorithm. They had been listening the whole time, and they had decided if they couldn't buy the key, they would take the key holder off the board. The chaos descended upon the serene garden with the violence of a thunderclap, shattering the peace into a million jagged shards of red and blue light. Police officers swarmed the gazebo from every angle, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of shouting that made it impossible to think or breathe. Clara felt her knees give way as the sheer weight of the injustice crushed her, the vision of her daughter waiting at the school gate flashing before her eyes like a final, desperate prayer. She reached out for Lucas, but a uniformed officer intercepted her, his grip firm and unforgiving on her arm, treating a mother protecting her child's future like a dangerous criminal. Mr. Henderson, the man who had just shaken hands on a deal, immediately retreated to the edge of the gazebo, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that screamed of cowardice. He offered no defense for the two people he had used as pawns, his loyalty evaporating the moment the flashing lights appeared, proving that his corporate survival instinct was the only truth he served. He watched with wide, terrified eyes as the officers forced Clara's hands behind her back, the metallic click of the handcuffs sounding like the locking of a cage door, sealing her fate. Lucas stood in the center of the storm, strangely motionless amidst the swirling activity, like the eye of a hurricane observing the destruction. He didn't struggle when a burly officer grabbed his shoulder and spun him around, though the unwanted physical contact usually sent his sensory processing into overdrive. His face was pale, beads of sweat standing out on his forehead, but his eyes were locked on something invisible to everyone else, calculating a countdown that only he could see. The officer shouted at him to stop resisting, even though he hadn't moved a muscle, projecting aggression onto a man who was simply trying to remain anchored in reality. "Please," Clara screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria as she was shoved toward a waiting patrol car. "We didn't do anything. We are the victims. You have to listen to us." Her pleas fell on deaf ears, lost in the static of police radios and the adrenaline of the arrest, dismissed as the lies of a guilty woman. The desperation in her voice was a physical pain, a raw frequency of suffering that cut through the garden. But the machine of the law had already decided she was a cog to be removed. The officer handling Lucas pushed him roughly against the wooden railing of the gazebo, pulling his arms back with unnecessary force. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer recited, the Miranda rights sounding less like a protection and more like a curse. Lucas winced at the pain in his shoulder, his breath hitching in his throat, but he didn't cry out. His mind, focusing entirely on the phone, still clutched tightly in his right hand. He needed 1 second, just 1 second of freedom to execute the final command. "I am not silent," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible over the sirens, but filled with a terrifying intensity. "And neither is the truth." He wasn't speaking to the officer. He was speaking to the variable he had held in reserve. With a dexterity that defied his position, he twisted his wrist just enough to slide his thumb across the screen of his phone. It wasn't an upload button. It was a broadcast trigger, a signal sent not to a server, but to the local mesh network. Suddenly, a high-pitched screech of audio feedback tore through the air, painful and piercing, causing everyone in the garden to instinctively cover their ears. The sirens seemed to falter, drowning in the electronic shriek that emanated from every speaker within a mile radius. The officers stopped, looking around in confusion, their hands hovering near their holsters, as the environment itself seemed to turn against them. The feedback loop stabilized into a hum, and then the large digital information screens at the garden entrance flickered violently. The tourist advertisements for floral arrangements vanished, replaced instantly by a grainy, high-contrast video feed. It was the security footage from the office, time-stamped and clear as day, showing Mr. Robert logging into Lucas's computer. But it didn't stop there. The screens split, showing multiple angles: the coffee shop where the hack originated, the email logs, and most damning of all, a transcript of the phone call threatening Clara's daughter scrolling rapidly in bold red text. The officer holding Lucas loosened his grip, his eyes drawn irresistibly to the giant screen looming over the garden. The crowd of onlookers that had gathered to watch the arrest gasped in unison, a collective intake of breath that sucked the tension out of the air. The video was playing the audio now, the voice of the lawyer, Ms. Vance, clearly conspiring with the third-party buyers to frame the autistic liability and the desperate mother. The evidence wasn't hidden in a file. It was 50 feet tall and screaming at the world. That's the lieutenant's sister," one of the younger officers stammered, pointing at the photo of the lawyer that had just popped up on the screen alongside the wire transfer records. The corruption wasn't just corporate. It bled into the very system that was currently arresting them. The revelation hit the police force like a physical blow, stripping away their righteous authority and replacing it with the cold, hard realization that they were the weapon being used by the villains. Mr. Henderson stared at the screen, his mouth agape, watching his own secret conversations with the board scrolling past. Lucas had released everything, not just the evidence of innocence, but the evidence of everyone's guilt. The garden, which had been a cacophony of noise moments ago, fell into a profound, stunned silence. The sirens were cut, the shouting stopped. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. In that silence, Lucas slowly pulled his arms away from the officer, who was now too paralyzed by shock to stop him. He straightened his jacket, brushing off the invisible dust of the encounter, and turned to face the crowd. He didn't look triumphant. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had just carried the weight of the world across a tightrope and set it down without spilling a drop. The probability of justice increases when transparency is absolute, Lucas said into the quiet. His voice wasn't loud, but in the total silence of the stunned room, the stunned garden, it carried like a bell. He looked at Clara, who was weeping now, not from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of vindication. The officer uncuffed her without being asked, his hands shaking slightly as he realized he had almost destroyed an innocent family. The police captain, a grim-faced man who had arrived in the second car, walked slowly into the gazebo. He didn't look at Lucas or Clara. He looked at Mr. Henderson, and then he looked at the screen where the lawyer's face was still frozen. He took a deep breath, the sound loud in the quiet air, and turned to his men. "Release them," he ordered, his voice gruff, "and get the cuffs on the man in the suit. We have a new suspect." Lucas walked over to Clara, who collapsed into his arms, sobbing into his shoulder. He stood stiffly, unsure where to put his hands, before awkwardly patting her back in a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. The entire park watched them, the single mom and the autistic genius, standing amidst the ruins of the corporate trap they had dismantled. They had planned an injustice, but Lucas's reaction hadn't just silenced the room, it had rewritten the rules of the game. 3 months later, the office didn't look like the same place where dreams went to die. It looked like a place where the future was being written. The gray, oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by an energy that felt cleaner, lighter, and surprisingly human. The cubicle walls that had once acted as barriers were lowered, allowing the morning sunlight to flood the space, warming the corners where shadows used to hide. Clara walked through the double doors, not as a trembling employee afraid of her own shadow, but as the vice president of operations, her heels clicking a rhythm of confidence that echoed off the glass walls. Mr. Henderson's office was empty, stripped of the mahogany desk and the intimidating leather chair, currently being repurposed into a collaborative quiet zone for deep work. The legal proceedings against him and the buyers were dominating the news cycle, a public cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating the people you view as disposable. The toxicity he had cultivated was scrubbed away like graffiti, leaving behind a blank canvas that the remaining employees were eager to paint with integrity. The fear of layoffs had vanished, replaced by a collective sense of purpose, driven by a leadership team that actually valued the truth. Clara paused by the reception desk to sign for a package, catching her reflection in the glass, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The dark circles under her eyes were gone, replaced by a glow that came from sleeping through the night without the crushing weight of impending poverty. Her daughter Mia was now enrolled in a specialized art program, paid for by the bonus Clara received for restructuring the department. The financial knots that had strangled her heart for years had loosened, allowing her to breathe, to plan, and to finally live in the present moment. Down the hall, the door to the CTO's office was open, a radical change from the closed-door policy of the previous regime. Inside, the lights were dimmed to a soothing amber hue, and the hum of high-performance servers provided a white noise backdrop that replaced the chaotic chatter of the open floor. Lucas sat at a standing desk, surrounded by 3 monitors, conducting a symphony of code with the same intense focus he had used to organize his pencils. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was in his element, the architect of a system that was now as transparent as it was powerful. The employees who used to snicker behind their hands now approached his door with a mix of reverence and hesitation, waiting for his signal before entering. They didn't see him as the weird guy anymore. They saw him as the oracle who had saved the company from implosion. When he spoke during meetings, the room fell silent, not out of awkwardness, but out of a desperate need to hear what he had to say. His words were few, but they were heavy with meaning, cutting through the corporate fluff to the logical core of every problem. Lucas still didn't make much eye contact, and he still wore his noise-canceling headphones when the ambient noise spiked above a certain decibel level. But something fundamental had shifted in his posture. The perpetual hunch of self-protection was gone, replaced by a straight spine. He no longer expected the blow. He expected the work. He had learned that his mind wasn't a defect to be managed, but a weapon to be respected, and that validation had healed wounds that no medicine could touch. At lunchtime, the ritual that had started it all returned, but this time, it was a celebration rather than a consolation. Clara found Lucas on the rooftop terrace, a quiet spot overlooking the city skyline, far away from the noise of the cafeteria. He was unwrapping a sandwich with surgical precision, the foil crinkling softly in the breeze. He looked up as she approached, and the corner of his mouth twitched upward, a microscopic movement that Clara knew was his version of a beaming smile. "The algorithmic efficiency of the new workflow is up 40%, Lucas stated as a greeting, skipping the small talk he found so exhausting. He moved his lunchbox to the side, making space for her on the bench, a gesture of inclusion that spoke volumes. It was his way of saying she belonged in his world, that she was a variable he wanted to keep constant. "And employee satisfaction is up 80%, Clara replied, sitting down and opening her own lunch. "It turns out people like working for a genius who doesn't steal their ideas." She looked at him with a profound sense of gratitude, remembering the moment in the garden when he had stood between her and the police. He wasn't just a colleague. He was the godfather of her new life. Lucas split his sandwich in half, offering the larger portion to her, just as he had done on the worst day of her life. "I have recalculated my nutritional needs," he said, a lie so transparent and kind that it made Clara's heart ache. "This surplus is unnecessary for my energy output." It was the same act of charity, but now it came from a position of strength, a sharing of abundance rather than a rationing of survival. They ate in a comfortable silence, watching the city move below them, two survivors who had climbed out of the wreckage together. The wind played with Clara's hair and she closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. She thought about how close she had come to giving up, to accepting the injustice as her lot in life. It terrified her to think of the alternate reality where she hadn't followed Lucas into the elevator, where she had stayed silent. "You know," Lucas said suddenly, breaking the silence, his eyes fixed on a cloud formation. "They thought my silence was emptiness. They did not understand that silence is where the processing happens." He turned to look at her, his gaze steady and clear. "The code only works because of the spaces between the lines. The zeros are just as important as the ones." Clara looked at him, realizing that he was teaching her one last lesson. The world was loud, chaotic, and often cruel, filling every void with noise and lies. But true power didn't scream. It waited, it observed, it planned. And when it finally decided to speak, it didn't need to shout to be heard. "You saved us, Lucas," Clara whispered, placing her hand over his, feeling the steady pulse of the man who had reordered her universe. "You silenced the room, but you gave us a voice." Lucas looked at her hand, then back at the horizon, processing the data of her gratitude. "Correction," he said softly, the city light reflecting in his eyes. "We corrected the error together." As they sat there, high above the noise of the world, the story of the single mom and the autistic man wasn't just a memory of pain. It was a testament to the invincible nature of truth. They proved that sometimes the people who are overlooked are the only ones seeing the whole picture. And in the end, the justice they found wasn't given to them. It was built, line by code, silence by silence, until it was too solid to be ignored. If you've ever felt the crushing weight of being underestimated, or watched brilliance be treated as invisibility simply because it didn't fit the mold, this story is your reminder that the truth always finds a way to break the silence. Don't let this message end here. Subscribe to the channel to amplify the voices the system tries to mute. Hit that like button if you believe that integrity eventually wins. And tell us in the comments, have you ever had to stay silent to survive a toxic workplace? Or have you witnessed a quiet Lucas turn the tables when no one expected it? Your story might be the exact hope someone else needs to find today.